Atalanta was a young and beautiful princess, but she was very unhappy. Ever since she could remember, she'd wanted to be a boy. "I wish I didn't have to stay at home and spin and weave," she stormed. "I should like to train with the boys and be able to run and jump and learn to shoot with a bow and arrow so that I could hunt the wild boar." And because her parents wanted to see her happy, they let her do as she pleased. She dressed like a boy, in a simple linen tunic. She slung her ivory quiver with its feather-tipped arrows over her left shoulder, and in her right hand she carried her bow. Year after year she trained and practiced, so that at length she became more skillful in tracking down and shooting wild animals than any of the young men, and she was so fleet of foot that she won every race. The time came, however, when the king said to his daughter, "Your mother and I are very pleased that you win all the races, and that you're so skillful in hunting the wild boar, but we do feel it's time you thought of getting married." "I have thought about it," she said, "and I've decided that anyone who wishes to be my suitor must race against me. If he wins, I'll marry him." Her father thought this was a splendid idea. "But if he loses," Atalanta continued, "he must die." Because Atalanta was so beautiful, many young men came to race against her in the hope of winning her hand. The crowds flocked to the arena where the games were held, cheering and applauding as each time the princess ran faster than her competitors. Each time the suitor had to pay the penalty. At first, Atalanta found it all most exciting. Each suitor was convinced that just because he was a man, he could run faster than she could, so she didn't feel in the least sorry for any of them when they lost. Until one day, when she was wandering in the wood, a young man stepped out from behind an old oak tree, and it seemed to Atalanta that she'd never before met such a handsome youth. "Atalanta," he said, "3 times I've gone down to the arena with the crowds to watch you racing against princes who wish to marry you. Each time I've watched how you have sped round the course as though you wore the winged sandals of Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Each time I've felt no pity for your suitors, for they couldn't run nearly as fast as you, and none was worthy of such a beautiful bride. But each time I've watched you, I have fallen more deeply in love with you. Will you accept me as your suitor?" "What is your name?" Atalanta asked. "Hippomenes," the young man answered. "Very well, Hippomenes. You may race with me tomorrow, but if you lose—" "There is only one thing in the world that I want, and that is you, Atalanta. If I cannot marry you, I shall be content to die," he replied. And before the princess could say another word, he was gone. Atalanta sighed, and for the first time in her life she didn't want to run in a race. It would be a pity for such a handsome young man to die, she thought. Now, Hippomenes didn't like the idea of dying either, and so that evening he went to the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. "Tomorrow I race for the love of Atalanta," he cried. "Help me to win her, O goddess." Aphrodite was pleased to help the handsome young man, so she took 3 golden apples from her altar. As she handed them to Hippomenes, she explained very carefully what he must do to win the race. The next day the crowds flocked down to the arena again, taking with them ripe figs to eat and juicy melons to quench their thirst. They looked hopefully at the handsome Hippomenes, hoping that he might win. Loudly and enthusiastically they cheered as the king and queen took their seats at one side of the arena. Atalanta walked to the opposite side, where Hippomenes was already waiting. She'd hardly slept at all that night. Something was wrong. but she didn't know what it was. "You still have time to withdraw," she whispered to Hippomenes, knowing that no matter how fast he ran, she could run faster. "Why should I do that?" the young man asked. "Because I don't want you to die," Atalanta answered, suddenly discovering that she had fallen in love with Hippomenes. "Let the race begin!" the crowds shouted. The trumpets sounded, the crowd roared, and Atalanta and Hippomenes were off, each running so swiftly and effortlessly that their feet scarcely seemed to touch the ground. "He's running as fast as he can, and will tire long before I do," Atalanta thought. "What shall I do?" "Help me, Aphrodite," Hippomenes murmured, and then, with a great effort, he drew ahead and dropped onto the track the first of the golden apples which the goddess had given him. Atalanta, seeing the golden fruit flashing in the sunlight, paused to pick it up, holding it aloft for the crowd to admire. When she started to run again, Hippomenes was well ahead. Increasing her speed, Atalanta had almost caught up with him when he threw the second golden apple to the ground. Again Atalanta stopped to pick up the golden fruit, and then, for the second time, ran to close the gap between Hippomenes and herself, while the crowd cheered and urged on the young man. Just as Atalanta drew level with him for the third time, Hippomenes let fall the last of his golden apples, and Atalanta, stooping to pick it up, somehow fumbled so that it rolled away, and it took her twice as long to grasp it firmly. When she began to run again, the gap was even wider, so that even though she ran faster than she'd ever done in her life, Hippomenes finished first. Nobody was happier than Atalanta when the judges declared that Hippomenes was the winner of the race, and, breathless and triumphant, he turned amidst the cheers of the crowd to claim her as his bride.